So we can see here the usual, we can see the white space again on that block quote, but that's okay. It's mentioning the participants, but now look, it's also saying this observation is very important to the examiner who's reading it, that they see some sort of familiarity, especially on your part. It really is something that is just really going to help you as you go forward. But look, I mean, don't let me say it. Look at this. This is a great example of it here. So it doesn't do you any favors. So just make sure that whatever you have in this chapter is discussion chapter is only findings and literature review stuff. No mention of the research question. Welcome to another video. This one is going to be on the discussion chapter, another favorite chapter of everyone. A question did arise from the last video on the findings chapter, which was basically, well, what do I do when my findings and discussion chapter are the same? There's nothing really you can do. I mean, I don't personally think that's a great approach, is to put the two of them together. I think sometimes you can get a bit sort of led astray by that particular format. I would say if your findings and discussion chapter are shoved together into one chapter, you can still use everything from this video and just compile it differently. I will give an example at the end of a findings and discussion chapter that are put together, as well as the findings and discussion chapter that are kept separate. This chapter, like the other chapters, I'm going to break down the structure of it, show you what headings you're going to have in this chapter, what it should look like, and basically what it shouldn't look like. Okay, so I have some basics here on how to approach this chapter and how to really just stop yourself from walking into a cul-de-sac. First thing, use the same headings from the previous chapter, your findings chapter. It's very important to the examiner who's reading it that they see some sort of familiarity, especially on your part. So your ability to say, hey, I realize in this section or this chapter that what I'm doing is I'm comparing my own findings to the previous literature. And the best way to do that, or the best way I can show you I'm doing that, is to just use the same heading again. So that's completely fine. So use the same headings you have. If you have 6 headings that equals 6 themes in your findings chapter, use those 6 headings again in your discussion chapter. Now, the question arises, what if you have a heap of sub-themes? Do not use the sub-themes in this chapter just as headings. So just if you have 6 main themes and you have a load of sub-themes, just use the 6 main themes as the headings. You're going to be discussing how the theme overall interacts with the previous literature, not how a particular sub-theme interacts with a piece of literature, because once you go down that path, you have to do it for everything. So if you do it for one sub-theme, you have to do it for every single other sub-theme. And if, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 sub-themes don't have anything to do with the literature you reviewed, then the examiner is going to think, okay, they've not put anything in for that. And the reason you didn't put anything in for it could be something as simple as, well, there's nothing I can put in for it. But the examiner doesn't take that as an excuse. They just think, okay, well, they never bothered. If you have an umbrella theme, a theme that encompasses all the sub-themes underneath it, as it should do, that's perfectly fine just to keep mentioning that theme in relation to the previous literature. The 2-paragraph rule. And the 2-paragraph rule is something I tell any student to put in and to use and to never forget it, because it really does break down what you're supposed to do in this chapter. So the first paragraph should be a summary of the main theme again. So if theme 1 went over 2 or 3 pages in the last chapter, just bring it down to a paragraph and say the main, or even, the paragraph can be half a page. You're basically just saying that these are the most important things about this particular theme. And the reason you're mentioning that is because in the second paragraph, that's when you bring in the literature and you say, interviewee 1 and interviewee 2 said this about this particular theme. And you're given a laydown of everything that has been said about that theme. Now the next paragraph you go, and this can also be found in the study of such and such. Interviewee 2 mentioned this, and that can also be found in the study of such and such. Or although this has not been mentioned in the literature review, such and such brought this up. So you're basically just saying a compare and contrast between what has been said and what has not been said. Now I mentioned that 2-paragraph rule, so an important thing is to remember that you're going to be different drafts of this chapter. So draft 1 is going to have that very basic 2-paragraph rule. By the next draft, just blend them a bit better together. Now I already mentioned that bit of a blend in the last example I was given, where you have interviewee 1 said this, and what they said can also be seen in the study of such and such. But in your initial draft, you should just follow that 2-paragraph rule. Here's a summary of the team, and then here's all the literature that relates to that particular team. So another important aspect of the discussion chapter is not to go back and forth. So don't keep mentioning, once you're done with team 1, go on to team 2, and go on to team 3, and so forth. So don't start mentioning, hey, this is kind of similar to what was said in team 1, or what I've seen here in team 3. Hey, look, this literature relates to what interviewee 1 and 2 were saying. And it also goes back to what was said in team 1. Do not do that. That's just going to create a mess. Going back and forth really only comes into play in the conclusion chapter. Because at that point then you can start making links between the different teams and the different ways they interact with the literature. So don't, save yourself a lot of trouble. So don't start doing that sort of work earlier on, because it's so hard to keep track of all that stuff in the discussion chapter. So when you get to your conclusion chapter, it's much easier because you're summarized that into a page or two if it's only going to be a 20 or 25,000 master's thesis. Now look, the slides have come back yet again. So here we go, a qualitative structure. So we can see here the usual, we can see the white space again on that block quote, but that's okay. Because what we're now doing is, we can see this has been through a few drafts, but the 2-paragraph rule does sort of apply here. You can see it. So you can see here on the second slide, friendship dissolution in times of transition and stress. So it's mentioning the participants, but now look, it's also saying this observation links the bioevolutionary stress theory proposed for women by Taylor et al. So we're mentioning our participants, we're mentioning what they're saying, we're giving a bit of a summary of it. We're not giving the full-on block quotes of it, or we're not giving like quotes and quotes and quotes of it. We're giving a little bit of a summary. We're saying how it links back to a piece of literature. We're then saying, hey look, there's a bit more to be said here about the literature. And now we're given the block quote. Now we're given a bit of a basis on it. And we can see as we go on here, such friendships might emerge during times when they're less likely to do so. This conjecture is based on Taylor et al.'s assertion. So look, again, we are making a statement from our own findings, and then we're linking it back to the previous literature. So obviously, when you're going through the discussion chapter, you don't have just rely on one particular. Like there's nothing worse than seeing the same study used over and over and over again to relate back to your literature. So in that previous example, we've seen Taylor et al. That's only for half a page, but I do see in people's thesis that does travel across over 2 or 3 pages. So this is a good example of how to mix that up again and how to just mention loads of different types of studies in the same page and in the same team. So teachers' beliefs and reported experiences regarding EE, so extensive English. Now we can see here, look, there's a mention again of teacher A believed blah blah blah. Furthermore, both teacher A and teacher D articulated blah 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 blah. So you have the first paragraph rule, which is here's my findings, here's a summary of my findings. And now we're going to introduce paragraph 2 into the equation, and here it is here. These areas align with objectives outlined in the national curriculum, both in the 2006 and 2020 versions. So we're relating it not back to literature per se, but policy. And that's okay, because you're going to have, not everything is going to be a study per se, or a book or an article. Sometimes it's going to relate it back to policy or documentation. And if we come on to the next paragraph here, we can see all 4 interviewed teachers reported their personal engagement to EE, although only one teacher spoke English outside of the professional context infrequently. So again, the 2-paragraph rule. We have a little summary of what went on in the findings chapter. Just give a little brief summary saying this is what went down in regard to this team. And now look, we have the paragraph 2 coming in here. Therefore, it appears that the teachers were familiar with EE activities. Considering that teacher cognitions encompass what teachers know, believe, and think. Their experience with EE may influence their instructional practices. In line with the findings in this study and previous research, students also appear to be highly familiar with EE activities. So look, we can see a range of people. We have Borg, we have Rindell, we have Sundevist and Sylvain. That's what you want to see. You want to, as you're moving between paragraphs in this chapter, you want to see, hey look, there's a good blend here between the students' presentation of their findings, but also, hey, I'm not going too far without mentioning the literature I reviewed in chapter 2. And even in the quantitative examples of discussion, you still see that 2-paragraph rule. It really is something that is just really going to help you as you go forward. But look, I mean, don't let me say it. Look at this. This is a great example of it here. So we have demographic insights. So we're using the demographic data we've collected, and we're trying to show, well, look, this sort of it agrees with what's in the literature beforehand. So if we read a bit of it here, we can see that this contrasts with broader research findings. So they've given some sort of a very brief summary, like in the realm of demographic data, both male and female respondents exhibit similar levels of negative feedback across various dimensions. Okay, so we've made a statement there. That's grand. That's perfect. So that's summarizing the crux of what was going on in the findings. But we're going a little bit further now, because this is the discussion chapter, and we can see here in this paragraph, look, we have Parham and Ralph, we have Palumbo, and we have the other people I can't pronounce there, but Gurvich et al. I mean, we're not going too far without mentioning the literature, and that's the most important thing to remember. You've got to remember to mention the literature. Do not go too far, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, or mixed. Do not go too far without mentioning the literature, because otherwise you're just repeating the findings chapter again. And we just have a final example there. Nearly a fifth of the respondents indicated that both their workload had become less manageable and that they struggled to carve out personal time since the advent of COVID-19. This situation can create a self-defeating cycle where remote workers overexert themselves, leading to a decline in their well-being. And then look here, we have all the literature being mentioned. Mention your own findings, nearly a fifth of the respondents, that's your own findings, and then mention the literature. And what this example here is shown is that there's a great blend now. So this is maybe a third or a second or a third draft where that 2-paragraph rule is not so evident because they're blended nicely together now. But I'd say in the first initial draft of this, they were separated out. So the first paragraph was mentioned the fifth of the respondents, and then the second paragraph just had everything it was related to in the literature. So that's a great example now of something that has been blended well together. Now, all my mixed methods friends, I haven't forgotten about you here. So again, there's not going to be too much change from what you've seen before. You're basically just blending the two together now. So, and we can see in these examples, so let's just have a look at paragraph 2 here. So conversely, participants in the control and print conditions exhibited a decline in the percentage of individuals who regarded themselves as experts in applying the RCE strategy. So we are mentioning the findings, which is clearly quantitative because we have statistics here, we have percentages. But look, lo and behold, not too far away, we have the literature introduced and how that relates to your own findings. Now, that's the quantitative aspect, but Bill, where's the qualitative part? I mean, this is a mixed methods. Okay, well look, just hang on a sec. If we move over now, there it is there. Look, there's quotes from the people that were interviewed, and there's also a percentage there. So with regards to reflective practice, which is one of the building blocks of transformative education, this study found that the students rated the college highly, with 95% believing that the HDAP course prepared them to be reflective practitioners. And now we move into the little bits and quotes. But look at the end there. That's an introduction of a piece of literature into the equation. So again, we have findings, and then how that finding relates to the literature reviewed. And that's exemplified by the opening line there. This is in line with current TC requirements, and then the quote there from the Teaching Council to explain how it is in line with those findings. So look, that's the discussion chapter in a nutshell. It's not too hard once you see how it's done. And I would encourage people like the finance chapter to seek out other people's thesis and just to see, well, what does it look like? How am I supposed to write this chapter? The main headings, again, to come back to it, is going to be the headings from your finance chapter. If you use the same headings, you can't go wrong. And that will essentially confine you to within what your thesis is about. So you're not going to go off topic. One of the most common mistakes in the discussion chapter is people who decide, you know what, this is the best time to bring in new literature and new studies. Why is it not in your literature review? I don't understand why this happens, but it does happen a huge amount. So let's try and nip it in the bud here in these videos. I do think there's a huge problem with introducing new literature in this section, because if it's not mentioned in the literature review, it gives the impression that you have decided, do you know what, I don't have enough here, I'm going to get some more stuff to help bolster my arguments. Which begs the question, that's perfectly fine, but why not just move that stuff that bolsters your argument back into the lit review chapter and start afresh in the discussion chapter as if nothing has happened? So whatever you introduce in terms of literature into the discussion chapter, whether it's a section in the finance chapter or its own separate chapter, make sure that it only relates to what's in the literature review, nothing new. Another thing to avoid is do not mention your research question in the discussion chapter. If you do, if you start saying to yourself, well, you know what, theme 1 here relates to all these literature, all these studies I looked at in chapter 2, and that helps answer objective 2 or 3, and therefore it helps answer the research question. If you do that now, when you get to your conclusion chapter, you're going to be scratching your head because you're going to think, well, what am I going to say here? And that prompts people to think, well, maybe I should write something completely off the book or off the wall. It doesn't do you any favors. So just make sure that whatever you have in this chapter is the discussion chapter is only findings and literature review stuff. No mention of the research question. Okay, so another video we got through. I think I'm getting a bit more used to this, I wouldn't say better, but I'm definitely getting more used to being in front of the camera. It's something I'm going to work on. You know, I know I'm probably doing a lot of mistakes. I know I'm probably got to look back over this footage and realize that there's a booger up my nose, or, you know, the light is shining directly into my eye. So, you know, things like this we'll work on. Just like you're going to work on your thesis, I'm going to work on making these videos better. So until we see each other again, take care.